So, in conclusion, I hope that some of the development people will be here. I don't think very many are here. The pre-Columbian sites on the Pearl Islands are not just ugly piles of shell. They represent the daily activities of past societies and inform us about past island and culture and biological diversity in space and time. Particularly important sites like the one we've been excavating should be preserved if possible, intact. What I meant to say was that Pearl Island Inc. have promised to save this site for posterity. And I was hoping that Otto Malo, the engineer, will be here to thank him personally for this. If these sites cannot be saved because of the demands of development, they should always be sampled for biological as well as cultural remains. And this often does not happen. Archaeologists who go out there couldn't care less about shells and bones. We're proposing that the pre-ceramic colonists were the first human settlers and that they must have arrived in seaworthy craft. They were farmers and they must have opened forest tracts for planting. The island non-fish fauna was depauperate but slightly richer in species than today. A very small deer and a common opossum now vanished from the island were hunted vigorously. Other species that were hunted regularly, one must note, boas, agoutis and green iguanas, are still abundant on this and other islands. And I believe that their continued abundance through later pre-Columbian historical and modern periods indicates considerable resilience and suggests the persistence of extensive wooded habitats on the archipelago until modern times. The only recorded case of cetacean exploitation in Central America was probably opportunistic, being a parallel activity to fishing in the waters of the islands of Pedro Gonzalez Island's many bays. Our data do not record the widespread neotropical taxa which were hunted by coeval pre-ceramic and ceramic peoples on the mainland. Raccoons, squirrels, and peccaries are obvious absentees. Of course, the absence of other species like sloths might simply reflect human dietary preference, and felids may have been on these very small islands already rare or absent for reasons well illustrated in all that Barrow Colorado work. After a 3,000-year hiatus, the people came back, and their presence was continuous, no doubt about that. They brought dogs, cane rats, marine toads, bobwhites, and perhaps white-tailed deer. What's interesting is that the Spanish chronicles, whether you can trust them or not, say that Isla del Rey, where a mighty chief lived, in their terms, was full of, I'm a klutz, was full of ciervos, which is the word they use in Spain for the red deer. So excavations on Isla del Rey are a top priority, and maybe we will find evidence for a reintroduction of the white-tailed deer. Now that that site's been protected, it should be re-excavated with much better techniques than ours, i.e. large aerial excavations. Florida, the Pire people from Florida came to see me last year and were all excited about going back, but I haven't heard boo from them since they were here. And this should increase and fine-tune diachronic data on biodiversity. We must start using allometry more rigorously to work out how big these fish are and to say something about size ranges and their decline in time. And we're doing this now in a big way with coral reef fish. And we should also apply further chemical analysis, not only for taxonomic reasons, we saw the results of the peptide chemistry, but also for identifying inter-island species movement and introductions for the mainland. And I've already contacted some people in the States about a big strontium analysis project. And of course, the deer population on San Jose, which is protected, should be sampled. Jorge Pino, a Panamanian student, who independently came to the conclusion that that deer on the island was not Masalambazo deer, when he came, he brought one of these guns which extracts tissues from live animals, but it didn't work. So I'm afraid he couldn't sample. It's absolutely vital that we get those tissues out and get them off to a reputable team of molecular biologists. Well, many thanks for your attention. Well, I've overstepped the allotted time a wee bit there, but I think maybe you'll forgive me for having a joint show with Stewart there. Any questions? Olga? I had to come down over because I left my earphones at home. And you know what that means.
Richard, are all Mazama forest dwellers, or do they...
Currently, that's an interesting question. Currently defined, they either live in forests like our friend, the red brocket here in Panama, Tamema, Masama Tamema, or they live in thickets. There are some small species, Masama nana, two Brazilian species which live in thickets. Nemorivaga, the one which this deer on San Jose Island was assigned to, prefers more xeric habitats than Wasubira and Tamema. But I don't think we've got Masama. Masama has to be redefined. It's a mess. I don't think we've got. I think we've got something which is more closely related to the white-tailed deer. Yeah, and in that case, it makes it all the other animals and birds on the islands, as George and lots of people have pointed out for eons, derived from the dry areas of the Pacific coast. And I can imagine that's the same with the deer. It makes much more sense if it's something related to Autocoileus with a long history of adaptation to savanna environments.
And Richard, what other mammals or how can you reconstruct the vegetation? What was the ecology?
You know, I made that point, but you think, well, humans arrived, they were maize agriculture way back 5,000 years ago. The vegetation presumably grew back. The people who came back were also maize cultivators. There's manos and metates all over the place. You think, wow, they must have trashed these islands. And then what are all those iguanas and agoutis doing out there? And boas, of course, are gobbling up the agoutis. I've got some fantastic pictures taken by my workforce. I didn't bring them in because they're so grisly. Boas strangling agoutis. But I mean, there must have been forest cover. The agoutis eat fruit, as everybody knows. And of course, we get palm nuts in excavations and things. So there must have been. And I wondered too whether, and this was a fairly complex society. I didn't want to go into that in this talk, but I will in another. And they talk about a big chief who lived on Isla del Rey, had a big flotilla of canoes. He traded the mother of pearl and the spondyles. He attacked coastal communities to take the women and that sort of stuff. But at the same time, they talk about all these, ciervos y conejos running around. But presumably the conejos are the agoutis, which is what the local people call them. The ciervos, who knows? I'd like to find out. So there must have been some kind of management going on. And maybe this small deer, if it's the same species, it might not be, but the small deer, the same species as our archaeological, is on San Jose today, is there because they use San Jose, which has big steep cliffs and is very difficult of access, as a hunting preserve. Who the hell knows? I mean, it'd be nice to get on San Jose if the owners would let us get on there and do some archaeology.
Do you see other examples in our text or other taxa with evidence of dwarfism?
Sorry?
Other taxa with evidence of dwarfism.
Oh yeah, there's a lot. There's on this site?
Yeah.
No, no. I'm sorry, Bill. The didelphis seem to be the same size range as modern didelphis. They are very variable species and they're very hard to work with, but they seem to be more or less the same. Maybe when I start measuring things, that'll be rubbish. The agouti is smaller, but they're certainly not dwarfed. I mean, that was pointed out by the mammalogists back in the 20s. Much smaller teeth, But the other animals, see, I mean, the boas are just enormous. I mean, only the deer, which seems either dwarfed or it's just a very, very small species. But, I mean, it's got to be the same animal as San Jose, which would suggest that it is somewhat dwarfed. Yeah, not as much as the escudo sloth. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a reason you can't do the genetics? Sorry. Is there a reason you can't do the genetics on the deer non-invasively? Is there a reason you can't do the genetics on the deer non-invasively from fecal samples or from bones, rather than getting tissue samples?
You probably could, and that's a very good point. Because to be quite honest, being a dumb old archaeologist, I sort of ignored I've ignored the fecal samples. If anyone, by the way, any ideas about how to sample that deer population for DNA will be welcome. So fecal pellets, I think, will work okay. The archaeological bone are useless. The organic fraction is just not viable, and you couldn't get a decent sequence out of it. Florida carted off a complete of stragglers 18 months ago and said they were going to analyze it for DNA. As far as I know, they did anything. I would really appreciate that if you could give me advice about how to sample that population with DNA. Yeah.
So you say at one point the peoples left, or when it's locally extinct, and then came back. Can you say anything about why they might have either left or died out?
It might be a load of nonsense, that hypothesis. It might be that our hiatus is an artifact of our very quick surveys. There's a rock shelter on San Jose Island, which I visited in 2008 on a trip with Harris. And it's a golden opportunity to see whether that hiatus is real or not. But the owners have been very recalcitrant. It's the Novi family, very recalcitrant. I can't get through to them, but archaeologists do more than just go and loot sites. So that might be an artifact of our sampling. You see that paper that came out by Toth and Science recently about the die-offs of coral in the Pacific? Toth and her associates have discovered there was a die-off of corals all along the Pacific, particularly in the Pearl Islands, between 4,000 and 1,500 BP. Now that's 1,500 years after my fellows ran. But it's sort of interesting that there was also possibly, Stewart knows about it, there's evidence from a lot of places in the Pacific of a slightly higher sea stand as well. Now the reason that Toth gives for the die-offs is intensification of the Nino cycle. Imagine, using boats out on the bay, you know what it's like. It's absolute hell being out there in a small boat. So maybe if you've got this situation with lots of windy and squally weather and unpredictable harvests because it all of a sudden is dry for 5 years, maybe that prevented people from going back. When they did come back, they were agriculturalists, fully blown agriculturalists. And what's interesting in the cultural record is you get contacts with the mainland waxing and waning, sort of zones of influence which wax and wane through time, according, I think, mostly to trade patterns, what was valuable and what was being moved on. Sorry, I'm waffling too much. Any other questions? Yes, Marco.
I got 3 questions, Richard. The first one, did you find any evidence of what the climate was like, the weather on that time in the area?
No, but bearing in mind what Toth's work is showing of the intensification of ENSO, between 4,000 and about 2,000, one can't discard climate change. And one can't discard the possibility that a particularly favourable climate was one reason for people going there in the first place. Huh?
Okay.
We should
We should let them go.
Yeah,
for a bit.
okay. Okay. Many thanks for your attention. Right?